Levinasian fear of totalities and Dasein. Um, let's start with the word, which hopefully has some poetic vitality. This felt mood of undulant vengeance, rhythmic moot in the hard mineral quality of the Nike at Samothrace. So let's take this image of material art that Leo Strauss has used in order to illustrate the breakdown of the doctrine of the eternal idea, the Platonic, the doctrine most often associated with Plato, in the peculiar teaching or doctrine we find in Nietzsche's attack, in Nietzsche's eternal return of the same or eternal recurrence during Daseins. Which apparently first appears in a publication of 1882, which is sometime after Dostoevsky's Dream of the Funny Man, I'll call it, of 1877. Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, or translate someone loose. So we couldn't translate as the gay science, because the word gay is, of course, undergone some change, just like sometimes it's better to translate in, if you have a Loeb Classics or something like that, where they translate as plunder, where you'd want to say plunder, they translate as booty. But of course this word is also in English undergone some changes. So interpretation or translation or performance is a very difficult thing. But I would translate die Fröhliche Wissenschaft as the boisterous wisdom, but then that's a problem because shaft indicates sort of a region out of which the wisdom is coming. So like wisdom, and it's not wisdom. It couldn't be wisdom. It's not wisdom craft. It's wisdom scape more. But and also Wissenschaft is routinely translated as science in ordinary publications like newspapers. But nonetheless, that's also a problem, because anyone who does so-called the demotic usage in, as it were, in academia is to say Wissenschaft is to be contrasted with science, and then to transform Wissenschaft into an English word in its own right, rather than routinely translating as Wissenschaft as the newspapers do. So let's try to take that perfectly animate and, as it were, internally flickering Nike at Samothrace, and which is a stone. Stone is supposed to be abiding and stable material, although we know that in the long run it breaks down like everything else. So just in the same way, we could have a simple metaphor on the breakdown of the idea of victory, just as that statue will one day no longer exist. So, for example, because war has come into some disrepute, I give only just one basic theme is that all this we no longer have ministries of war, but we have ministries of defense, and that's almost universal. So war has come into some disrepute, and maybe it would totally come into disrepute, and then victory can no longer be what it was at the time of, I don't know, Homer. It can no longer be this ecstatic moment of the somehow numinous loftiness, as it were, this sort of metaphysical thing which is associated in some way with the rage of Achilles. I mean, obviously, if you look at Iliad, savageness of rage, which is brought out in such straightforward and military detail, medical detail about killing, even to the ancients, was regarded as sort of glorifying war, making it greater than it is, rather than just someone like, I think, maybe Xenophon or somebody like that, who's described war with less splendor. But nonetheless not as we do today, where a war is routinely deplored everywhere by large populations, and there's protests and stuff like that. Another example of that is that people talk all the time about democracy and Karl Popper and so on, and Soros, as though democracy would, or especially the mental illness of Chomsky, as though if people would just be themselves and be allowed to be democratic, there would be no wars. But actually, it was the Athenians, when they created the democracy, one of the first things they did was, as good Democrats, they voted themselves into a bunch of wars, ruinous wars with the Spartans and all sorts of things. So, democracy doesn't necessarily lead to peace if you're with warlike people, and probably if you associate war with the masculine, then you could say the Romans are the most masculine people, or the most male people who ever were. And today we have feminine, maybe the Germans are the most feminine people that have ever existed. The current Germans. But that being as it may, let's think about, this concept of totality. So Levinas and his anti-totalities, and at the same time the concept of identity. So let's think of Russian identity for a second. Maybe Dugan will totally prescribe everything I say, I don't know. But it strikes one that we can attribute this Dasein. So if we have the Pneumomachia and we have the Russian Dasein, and then we regard this Russian Dasein as a kind of totality in which Nietzschean eternal recurrence as a sort of des end in Gonson. So the des indicates the genitive, where what we're saying is a totality according to the whole, so that everything that one encounters is part of the whole. I mean, the identity of something points back. The reason it's identical is because they're all pointing back to the principle, which is to say, like, if you're a Russian in that sense, then this is a Russian tree, this is a Russian house, this is a Russian sky, this is Russian stars, this is the Russian light. Everything has the identity according to the totality, and then if that totality is thought on the metaphor of the statue, which is supposed to be abiding and stable, it's nonetheless can suffer a breakdown and be threatened with total extinction. And then we see this mood of the metaphysical vengeance. So, for instance, that the Russians don't have the. I mean, then you could bring it into this talk of the Edward Said and so on, who has the propaganda mouthpiece, so that the people are all the time hearing about the world from the point of view of the Russians, or the world from the point of view of the Americans, or from the point of view of the NATO bloc. We hear much less about, in the English-speaking world, it's something of a novelty to hear about the Great Patriotic War rather than World War II. We hear much less about the larger number of deaths in terms of millions among Russians and Slavs than among Jews. And I believe also, but I haven't studied it closely, that before the death camps started a mass slaughter of Jews, of gypsies and homosexuals, there was quite a bit of slaughter of intellectuals, I think of German communists, for instance, who were outstripped by the coming to power of the Nazis, which also that's just as a matter, I mean, it's just as a matter of what people know best. We think of 1933 as the moment to come to power, but then one could make a long, detailed question. Did Hitler really come to power in 1933? No, because he wasn't really in power. The military at that time, the military, there were two big military leaders which were totally in power. The German military, even though Hitler's men outnumbered the actual German military, but Hindenburg was still alive. He was very old, but he had two senior officials that were under him that were actually in power with the military. Hitler was not in power with the military in 1933, only after Hindenburg. And in fact, they even got him to the night of Long Knives was not simply a purge of people, Hitler's rivals, but it was also that Hindenburg told him to do that, because there was supposed to be a securing that he would step down at some time. And so there's all kinds of things that, if our media environment were different, we'd think about differently. But this seems to sort of overlap with the totalities of the worlds, of the different eternal recurrences. And then you could say, would you have this identity, the Russian identity, always eternally recur? And we could think about that one in terms of ethopoiesis, in terms of so there's a saying since antiquity that much more severe in a way than what Zizek talks about with the laws of Manu, which detail, how to use the toilet, how to do all kinds of things in detail of daily life. But actually to say every instance of one's life should be ordered in a certain way, so that so for instance, Strauss, like the example of, if you're a serious person, you do not stand up and sit down for no reason, because that's has something of a funniness about it, in the sense of Dostoevsky's Dream of the Funny Man, or the absurd. I mean, I think Dostoevsky was thinking there of the concept of the absurd as something supposedly harmless, but ridiculous. I mean, it's translated probably correctly as the dream of the ridiculous man, but I don't like that translation because in the same way as the booty translation or the, because it has the word dick in it. It sounds a little bit, you don't have to hear it ridiculous that way, but it's the same way these translations always just gay, booty, dick. It's its own way. It's better not to give people any room to step in to make more funny the things that are funny. But because the original meaning, I think, is the Aristotelian meaning of there's some things which are blameless, stricto sensu. Being a hunchback, for instance, totally blameless, but it's in a way not the best. It's not the best thing, or I suppose being blind is or a dwarf or something. But especially maybe some things are more apt to make people laugh, which are actually totally blameless. The person is blameless for them. So we have this question of the Eigentlich, or the what a certain totality is really like, or what victory is really like, to extend this metaphor. And I think so. One, why does Nietzsche use? So one, let me say one more thing is Nietzsche himself. We always hear about Nietzsche with the will to power is the most popular thing to say, but that wasn't what Nietzsche identified himself with. He said his teaching is he identified himself with Zarathustra, and the teaching of Zarathustra is the teaching of the eternal recurrence of the same. But this is an ironic teaching in a certain sense, in the following sense, in that so far as we go from cyclical time, the time of the sun and the seasons, and this eternal recurrence time, which is this circular time. The circle is a coil. It takes you to the theine, or the divine, just as the start of a circle is not singular and determinate, neither is logos meaning teaching. So this is said of Platon during the period when people studied his dialogues and tried to enter into them, but not knowing which one to start with, and treated them as models for ethopoiesis, by which is meant the building or creating of character. And something like the way that Aristotle said, if you don't know what to do, think of somebody who you admire and then imitate them. Do what they would do. And Socrates has basically said this in the Apology, and saying that I'm only phronimos, I'm only sort of, my wisdom is limited in many ways. I know that I don't know, and so on. He did state certain things positively, such as that justice is that which improves the totality, or the polis. But this is an open-ended statement. And then, in a certain way, we could, I suppose one could say, from a philosophic point of view, leaving aside the divinity of Christ, one could say this opened the door for Christ to be the imitatio Christi, is exactly this thing, saying here's a personality higher than Socrates, and imitate him, even though we can't give you a rational account of why to do it in the way that Socrates gives rational teachings, but just imitate. So when we see one of these totalities break down, so in the sense of the move into so-called Faustianism associated with infinity, and also the move of, let's make three, so the circular time, linear time, metaphor, metonymy, and then a total breakdown into insanity with the Faustian accelerationism. would see sort of three versions of the same totality breaking into different sections, I guess. And then each one of these would have a memory which would uh, perhaps recall its vengeance, or perhaps claim to be merely held in abeyance or suspense and possible to reactivate. I think, so what I would want to say is, one, I think also Dugan thinks this way, but I'm not sure. But that's is how I hear him, is that, one, it's not that we're going back. The traditionalism isn't going back in time, because in a way the past doesn't exist. But the Middle Ages means more like the middle time. That's how I would characterize the middle time. And the middle time is the best totality or Dasein that we could get. But this doesn't mean that we're going back to the Middle Ages, but it means that we're going to the middle time, in the same way that the Chinese used to regard themselves as the Middle Kingdom. The middle time is then something like the thing that you would will to have eternally recurred as the same. But Nietzsche uses this circle of the eternal recurrence, knowing that this circle broke down into the linear time, knowing that the circular time broke down into the linear time, knowing that and then into the accelerationist time, or the Faustian time, or the Lombard Street investment time. Everything always in the future investments, the trip to Mars, the AI futures, money being directed always against the people into some pyramid in the future time. That's the main characteristic of the Faustian time, I think, and the much lesser, I think, the Friedrich der Grosse reasoniert so viel wollt und für ihr wollt aber gehorcht, or the reason all you want, but hear, hearken, obey. That freedom of speech thing, I think this is much less important. This is superficial. I mean, because already in ancient Athens, there was a kind of freedom of speech. It just wasn't a law. People were doing a lot of free speech. It's just that you could be executed for it. That's probably better, because I think a lot of these people, I won't say executed, but I'd say Trump should be totally suppressed. Alex Jones should be totally suppressed. Joe Rogan should be totally suppressed. They're imbeciles, and they're constantly producing bad guidance for people. We should have people that are capable of intellectual thought. Trump, we could possibly, on an aside, I'll say Trump, we could possibly analogize with Putin in the 2000s and say the fact that we brought somebody in that was sheer ego, who basically the way Trump operates is, I'm in power, so I can lie all I want. It doesn't matter, because I'm in power. I can do whatever I want. It's arbitrary. I think it's bad to have a leader like that in most cases. You want somebody who has intellect, and therefore has intellectual self-respect. And Vance has some intellectual respect. He's a human being. He's not a complete imbecile, egotist, subhuman like Trump. But sometimes a subhuman, when you have to break out of something, the sheer imbecility, egotism, subhuman idiocy is good for breaking out of the thing. So Caesar breaks out of the Roman Republic, and then Augustus comes in only afterwards as the first emperor. So we could have something like that. I think that would be good. And then you could say, okay, Trump served a purpose, just as Putin served a purpose at one time in the 2000s by suppressing Berezhevsky, seizing back the RT, or the National News Network, from the private oligarch Berezhevsky, making an example of him, and then taming the oligarchs in Russia, which is something that didn't happen in the Ukraine. And then you could say, okay, Putin was the savior of the Russians for a certain period of time, but then he should be removed at a certain period of time. His function is over. That's my view. But, okay, that's all kind of an aside. But let's think again on the question of, so one, let's just thematize this. We have totality is eternal recurrence of the same, as in some way opening up a kind of either a transfer of meaning or a metonymic link where the parts of both kind of flow together. And then we could think of them together, and also superimposing the image of the Leo Strauss's image of the Nike at Samothrace with its material, hard mineral quality, which nonetheless must break down, so that just as Nietzsche says, in the highest pinnacle of our being, sexuality comes into play. So Nietzsche thinking in the time of Darwin and evolutionary theory taking over, thinking in terms of already in a certain sense of social Darwinism. He's not for social Darwinism. He said this will be a calamity. This will lead to the capitalism which he describes as fraternities of rapacious individuals who exist for the sake of doing down the non-members. So those are corporations. That's the everyday thing, but we treat it in a Daswan way and say, oh, evil people are doing evil things somewhere else, but what can I do about it? We don't treat it in an Eigenlichkeit way and actually face up to it. This is a lot of what Heidegger's attempts at high rhetoric are, is sort of to say, even to awaken a sense that there is a problem is almost impossible in the age we live in. Just as when Gavin Newsom gave his speech to Political, he was largely met with laughter. One could say, a hopeful interpretation is like when you find out that somebody in your midst is a serial killer or something like that, Jeffrey Dahmer, or at least a sociopath, and somebody who's systematically bullied and murdered people, basically, then your tendency is to kind of laugh and not to want to take it seriously, because you don't want to believe that people that appear as normal can be evil. So in a certain way, when the political people laugh at Newsom, who's saying, look, Trump is doing bigger graft. He sends out his family in advance to these countries to steal money. He's taken 10%, just as Hitler nationalized the companies and subordinated them to the Nazi regime. He's taking holdings in the big companies so that they're sort of at risk of being jawboned, which is to mean they're risk. The point would be cause them so much pain that they have to capitulate and they have to follow orders. We have a 10% stake in your company. We can fuck you up if we wanted to. We're the government. We can send endless lawsuits. We can do all kinds of shit. So that's jawboning. That's probably a strategy of Trump's using to subordinate people. But the problem with Trump is he's doing it in an evil. His purposes are meaningless and stupid. So we should do the same. So in a way, that's okay, but we should remove Trump and put in somebody who's intelligent to guide things. In a way, I think it's good, but in a way, you need a changeover at some point from the simple records or the simple WWE World Wrestling Entertainment phase costumes and Max Headroom nonsense to somebody with something in some way resembling an idea or a philosophic kingship. And then my attitude is, since we have to work with what we have, let's make advance. That's good. He's at least a thinking person. But okay, so you have this situation of identity politics we should also see here in play. So the identities being something that in these totalities stretches back into their own histories and then presents themselves as eternal recurrences of the same, or as Dasein. So how does Levinas see this as the histories rather than history colliding? But let's see it more simply as from the, I'll end it here. It's just let's try to superimpose histories, totalities, eternal recurrence of the same, and the will that they should continue onto the concept of Dasein. What's the basic sense of Dasein is there's a kind of direct what would be solipsism, except that the others obviously exist. The other Dasein obviously exists, even though you don't have access from, in Nietzsche's term, their point of view. But in the ordinary sense, we don't really see it that way. We see it more like the way Aristotle sees education to the emotions, or, for instance, to megathos, in the sense that we see somebody else, unlike what Hobbes says. Hobbes says we see under capitalism it makes sense what Hobbes says. We see somebody else fall and we laugh because they're falling behind, and everything's a matter of personal competition. Things are less a matter of personal competition if you live in northern India, or if you're Hispanic in California, because life is ordered in a different way. Everybody gets married and has a family early on, so naturally you're going to be less competitive. Women, once they have their first child, they're going to be less competitive with other women. Men, once they're married, are going to be less competitive with other men. Naturally, I think that's the same in a lot of societies where things are more ordered. In a capitalist society, where everything's higgledy-piggledy, there's this inane, endless, Trumpian, adolescent competition goes on and on throughout the whole life. There's endless. There's never a regulated completion of anything. There's always the Popperian open society. In this sense, I think Dugin has a point, but it's sort of a hopeless point in a way, because we're in the mix of it and it has to be solved in a different way, at least in the West, maybe, and probably in Russia too. But maybe Orthodox can take over more power. I don't believe for a second all the people that in America, the younger people that study Orthodox and convert to Orthodox, are at bottom Orthodox, because they're not surrounded. You have to be in that world, in that totality. Otherwise, it remains the personal conviction and a conflict and a competition with the other personal convictions, which is basically the core of nihilistic liberalism anyway. So, but to get back to the sense of Dasein on analogy with these totalities in history, when Dasein sees the emotions, as Aristotle describes in the Rhetoric, of others, this is part of the Dasein world that makes it the total. It makes the total. It's kind of a contest against the total doubt of the Cartesian subject. There's no Dasein is not a subject. There's no subject because this artificial total doubt has to come into conflict with the fact that you see the other. You see, but they're not the other. You see somebody in a situation where, say, something tragic happens to this person, or this person's in peril, and somebody has a miscarriage, for instance, a miscarriage, and but the the emotion of Megathos leaps out into that directly and wants to heal that, but it can't. But it's nonetheless, it recognizes the situation as real. You can't simply say, oh, I have the omnibus dubitandum. So there's a contest. I think there's a contest would be out of our direct experience that we grow into. Then there would be a contest with the dubitandum, with the Cartesian Tao, such that it's not something that we live in directly any more than the view of Galileo that the universe speaks in the language of mathematics. Nobody has for their first language that they got in the family before schoolroom teaching the sense that everything is mathematical, even if some languages are kind of, Latin is probably more, reads like an equation when you look at it than do some other languages. German has more of a philosophic demand that you listen to the whole sentence before you comprehend it, whereas English you can always kind of break in more readily. There's different senses in different languages, but nobody has simply mathematics with their native language in the same way nobody has Cartesian subjectivity in the terms of the omnibus dubitandum as their native attitude, but rather it has to contest with this sort of original sense of the empathy with the other.